Good afternoon. I'm Jamie Allen Black, the CEO of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, and I thank you for joining us today. This is our monthly Crown Jewel Conversation, a series where you get to learn from and interact with our grantee partners. We call them Jewels, Jewish entrepreneurial women, executives, and leaders, women who are leading nonprofits addressing today's most pressing issues around the world, in the Jewish community, and well beyond. For those of you who don't know us so well, and as a reminder for those who do, JWFNY has granted more than $6 million to over 300 programs to address intractable problems around the world. That nearly 25 years of experience in grant making has led to the work we're doing today, supporting visionary Jewish women social entrepreneurs and leaders. Sometimes our program is mistaken as leadership development or yet another training opportunity. But what we offer is so much more. What we do is leadership acknowledgement and advancement. We're introducing you to cutting edge feminist leaders. So when you're looking for Jewish women role models working across sectors, we can introduce you through our expanding network. These women are the leaders we need right now, and we're proud to elevate their voices. The Jewish Women's Foundation of New York is where women's leadership is centered. Our conversation today is with Susan Weiss, founder and executive director of the Center for Women's Justice, an organization that uses the power of legal precedents to advance women's rights in Israel. Today, Susan will share with us how she identifies opportunities to make a difference, trains other attorneys to protect women's ability to self-determination, and raises awareness so women can exercise their rights freely. We offer these sessions to you at no cost, but if you find value in what we're doing, we hope that you'll consider 2 donations, one to the Center for Women's Justice directly, so Susan can continue her invaluable work, and then please consider matching that donation with one to JWFNY. We are the only organization providing these visionary, innovative, entrepreneurial leaders with a platform to broaden and deepen their base of knowledge and support. We'll put all the links in the chat. You'll find them in your follow-up email tomorrow. And at the end of this session, we'll give you other ways you can support the Center for Women's Justice. During the session, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to all of them. We've muted you to avoid background noise, so the chat feature is the best way to make sure your message is seen. And now I'm thrilled to introduce my partner, the president of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, Rachel Weinstein.
Thank you, Jamie, and welcome everyone. It's so great to see you. And Susan, I'm so happy to see you and so looking forward to our conversation with you. We're going to jump right in. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I'd like to begin just by you sharing a little bit about your background, your own personal background that lay the foundation for the work that you do now.
Okay. Well, first, before I do that, I also want to thank the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York and all of you who are listening. I really appreciate having this opportunity on this platform. I guess the way to describe my background is that I come from an Orthodox family. And I think that, plus I have very, very strong feminist roots. And those 2 things coming together have certainly played in what I do in Israel right now. When we were talking, Rachel, I think I described to you when I became a feminist, and I always tell the story, and I actually became a feminist when it was either 5 or 6 years old. And I was taken on a Friday evening to a Shalom Zachar, a celebration of the birth of the newborn baby boy. And I asked my parents, I said, these celebrations, this was quite a while ago, now they've introduced those type of celebrations, but for some reason, my feminist genes were there from the very, very beginning, and that has played a very, very strong role. My Orthodox background has been absolutely essential for the work that I do, since in Israel, what I do is I deal with the problems of women when church and state clash over their bodies. And I deal with it because there's this entanglement of religion and state in Israel, and it's the coercion of the halacha, of religious law, of Orthodox law. So my background has certainly played a part in the work that I do, as well as my feminist intrinsic genes, as I said.
And you grew up here in the US and you trained here in the US originally, right?
Yes, I grew up in Bayside, Queens, and I have a degree from Brooklyn Law School. I have an Orthodox Jewish education from the very, very beginning. Um, and I went to Stern College. I have another funny story about my Orthodox leanings from Stern College too, because when I had speech class in Stern College, I had to give a persuasive speech and I had to give a dramatic reading speech. So for the dramatic reading speech, I actually read a story from Ms. Magazine about challenging gender stereotypes. And in my persuasive speech, I tried to persuade everyone to have a child with a midwife and not with a doctor. So for some reason, and that was quite unusual for someone going to Stern College, back then. So I certainly have a lot of credentials in that sense from the feminist.
You were a feminist trailblazer from the beginning. And what took you to Israel and that, what took you to Israel, and then, how did that lead you to founding the Center for Women's Justice?
Well, I came to Israel out of Zionism, out of the desire to be part of Jewish history and to contribute to the Jewish people. And my husband was working as an attorney in a big law firm, and we saw an ad for a position in Israel. We didn't think that we could actually come to Israel as attorneys because of the language issues. We didn't, the facility in the language. And but he applied, we got it, and we got on a plane and came. And I can't say that I came to Israel with the desire to become the do tikkun olam, or to become the cause lawyer that I've eventually became. But it was certainly a slow development. I came and I had 2 little kids at the time, and I had 3 little kids, and I decided that I had to do a stage. I had to do my stage is what I had to do a little bit of work before I could get my degree, my license. And I did it, as I told you, in section 256 of the tax code, which is Irishum takbulim, where storekeepers don't register the money that they've received for a purchase when they go to buy something. And I did it so that I could just get my license, and I did it. I passed the oral examination, and then at a certain point in time, I just had to get out of the house. And I started volunteering for the women's organizations, and that just snowballed. I started volunteering for women's organizations like the ones you support. So I immediately saw there was a problem for women in that they couldn't get divorced. I really don't know that I realized or understood exactly why. I was given help by another woman feminist lawyer, Sharon Shinhav, who was working at the time at Namat. And I opened up casebooks, and I started teaching myself I tried to start teaching myself what was going on. And after volunteering for the women's organizations for WITSO at the time, someone suggested that I open up my own practice. Sharon sent me cases. I started taking legal aid cases, and I started working as a divorce attorney. Then after I was working as a divorce attorney at a certain period of time, I thought how nice it would be if I could start an organization that would empower women, using the women who recently studied and learned Jewish law. In Israel, let me back up a little bit. In Israel, um, there, as I said, there's an entanglement with religion and state, and all matters of personal status of marriage and divorce are determined by Orthodox Jewish law. In other words, it doesn't matter if you are religious, it doesn't matter if you're Orthodox, it doesn't matter if you're conservative, it doesn't matter if you're Reform or you don't believe in God at all. If you're Jewish, you have to get married with an Orthodox rabbi and you have to get divorced with an Orthodox rabbi. So after I was working in the field for a while, just helping women get divorced, I thought, and I saw the problems for women. And one of the biggest problems is the problem of the aguna, the woman who just can't get divorced because her husband won't agree to get divorced. I thought of the idea of starting up an NGO that would help these women. And at the time, Jewish women were starting to learn Jewish law in depth. They were starting to learn Gemara. And I had this thought that wouldn't it be nice to take women who had been empowered and now knew the language of religious law and use them to help the women who had been disempowered by the system and who couldn't get divorced. So at that point, I started my first NGO, and that was to give legal aid to women who are being refused a divorce. And slowly with time, I blossomed, one would say, or developed into a very different type of lawyer. So if I began as a divorce lawyer, how did I start my new NGO too? By the way, I have to give credit to, I told a friend of mine about the idea, and he gave me the first seed money for my first organization, Yad Lisha. So as I'm working in the field, right, as I worked as a divorce attorney, I figured, oh, you know, there's a few bad men who don't give a get, so you know, that's the problem. And then I started this first NGO, and I started thinking that the problem is actually bigger than a few bad men that don't give a get. The problem is probably the bad rabbis, you know, that don't really apply the halacha in a creative way, or are afraid to apply the halacha in a creative way, and they're, you know, too orthodox. And then I decided that there, you know, maybe there's really a problem in the halacha, the law itself. In other words, it's not really good enough to say that there's, you know, everything's just fine. It's just bad husbands or bad rabbis. The problem is systemic and intrinsic to the halacha. And I started reading, okay, my feminists, I started saying, okay, I started actually reading all the feminist literature, Kate Millett, you know, and Catherine McKinnon, and just everybody, okay? I just started reading everything I could. In other words, at first I was reading all the case books about Jewish law, and then I started reading all of the feminist literature to try and understand what was going on. And, you know, because when you see the word patriarchy, sometimes people roll their eyes, you know, what is patriarchy? And I began to understand that there was an intrinsic problem here, and that it wasn't good enough to just do legal aid to help women one by one. I wanted to start helping, you know, changing the system systematically. So I became from cause lawyer, okay, which is a lawyer who isn't just representing a particular client, but is representing cause. And the cause also changes, you know, so if my first, you know, I may have said, okay, my cause is I'm going to try and reinterpret the halacha, or I'm going to try and get civil courts to respond to what's the first breakthroughs, going from a legal aid lawyer who was just helping women help women get divorced, to understanding that we had a systemic problem, and the systemic problem was both internal to the halacha as well as internal to the way the state was structured. In other words, it became something much more than just the problem with patriarchal law. It became something which was a problem with political science problem, a problem of democracy, a problem of how do you define democracy? What is democracy? Can women should women be paying the price of our being a Jewish state? How are we a Jewish and democratic state without women paying the price for it? And then I began seeing that the issue was much bigger than just the women who can't get a get. Then we started seeing that there's the problem of women being discriminated against by the state, the religious arm of the state, not being given, not being allowed, not being given access to religious services, and not being able to use the mail whenever they wanted to. They couldn't have, if one of our clients, can you hear me? Because it says my internet is unstable. And one of our clients wanted to use the ritual bath, and the women who were the balaniyot, were the attendants at the ritual bath, didn't let her use the bath because when they asked her if she was married and she said no, they said she could not use the ritual bath. We represent women who are denied religious services at the wall. We represent women who wanted to be advisors to the rabbinic judges and weren't allowed to because they were women. We represent women who wanted to be on the committee to appoint religious judges. And then we also understood that the whole problem now was very wider than just the woman denied the get. We understood that in the area of personal status, aside from the discrimination cases that I just described, there was the problem of the woman who can't get the get, the problem of the woman whose child is being stigmatized, the mamzer, because she because she engaged in relations that were considered that are against religious laws, that are against the laws in Leviticus. Then we saw also the problem of the adulterous woman. So all this surveillance of women's bodies and of women's rights that is intrinsic to the problem of the patriarchal rules of Jewish divorce was something that I started to see very, very clearly. Helped to read all that material also. So I went from a legal aid organization, which was my first, to the Center for Women's Justice, where what we do is we try and get the civil arm of the state to respond to what's happening in the religious arm of the state. So that's how that was my development, which was also, an understanding of what was happening. So we went, as I said, from bad men to bad rabbis, to bad laws, to bad structure of the state. And I developed similarly as a cause lawyer, going from what's called a legal aid cause lawyer to an elite vanguard cause lawyer, which is someone who uses the civil law to respond to what's happening. And then I probably right now I'm between an elite, what's called an elite vanguard cause lawyer, and a social activist, a social movement cause lawyer. We're hoping to move into the social movement realm, where we will actually we're trying to get a groundswell. In other words, what we're doing right now, we want you to help us, okay? It's not enough for us to go to the courts and tell the courts to, or to try and get the courts to set precedents to change what's happening here. I really think that the true change comes from the bottom. I mean, we need both. We need that, top down and bottom up. But I think it's invaluable to us to have, the foundation and the people who are interested in the work that we do to become part of what we want to do, which is to change Israel so that women are treated well, so that we have a democratic country, and that we have a place where all of us can be proud, to be proud to say that this is the state of Israel. And it, the same way we are the startup nation, we're also a democratic startup nation, which can reinterpret, can protect, and and advance the rights of women.
Yeah, it's a unique challenge, right? When you're a religious state of how you create this balance between religious law and secular law and who is governed by what laws. I mean, it's a unique balance, and you're certainly working to move the marker there. So I think we're all intrigued to hear more. And I want to probe you a little bit, and maybe that you can share a little bit about some of the specific cases that you're working on, sort of what some of the examples that you are, and I know we're going to have questions that are in the chat about that, and I'll probe further, but maybe you can start by giving us a couple of examples that are on the top of your head.
Okay. Well, I actually spoke to my office today. We talked about this a little bit. One of the craziest stories that I tell is a story about a woman who called me at home once, and she had a very heavy Russian accent, and she called me and was very distraught and told me that she had been engaged in an orgy, and she was feeling really very, very bad about it, that she was getting divorced and she just needed to, in Hebrew it's called liparek, to just do something different, and crazy. And she went and she had an orgy. And I had just come back from the dentist, and I said, whoa, what is this story? This is a crazy story. And it actually took me 5 minutes, and I'm really proud of this story, 5 minutes to figure out that she was lying to me. And that the reason that she was telling me this story was because she had a child who was a mamzer, and she was trying to figure out a way to make the child kosher. And now, obviously, I didn't know. She didn't say, I'm lying to you. And I wasn't 100% sure. And I said, okay, I'm going to meet this lady. So which another person might have said, this is a crazy story. I'm not even getting into it. So I met this woman and her husband in this, in a coffee shop in Jerusalem. They were the loveliest high-tech people you can imagine, and it was 100% clear that I was right, okay? Because as crazy as it is, the law is that if your child in Israel is born within 300 days of your divorce, they register the child on the name of the ex-husband. Okay, it's called imputed paternity law. The paternity is imputed to the husband. Okay, who at the time, in other words, if he's born within 10 months of the divorce, they impute paternity to the ex-husband, and you cannot register your child on the name of the biological father. And so what happened was, it doesn't really matter how it happened, but she went to register to remarry, and believe it or not, the courts, if you have a child under the age of 2, they require you to go to court. That was just another crazy story. And they realized that they asked who the father of this child was, and they put the child on the blacklist, and the mother was distraught. Anyway, we at the Center for Women's Justice, one of the things that we're trying to say is that the state really has no right to put children on a blacklist, that there's no jurisdiction for the courts to do such a thing. So in this particular case, we solved it. We went to the Supreme Court. We told the Supreme Court to take the child off the blacklist, that there was no jurisdiction to do such a, to put her on there in the first place. And then the court sent the case back to the rabbinic courts, which found a way to resolve the issue, took the kid off the blacklist. And the mother thinks that we were angels that came down from heaven to save her. So that's one example of a case that we had.
Yeah. I have there's so many questions coming in the chat, and maybe I'll share some others, but let me see if I can get to some of these. Someone asked about, what are the laws for abortion in Israel? And have you worked with women who've had a hard time getting access to abortion? And how is that governed by these laws in the courts in this way?
It's not governed by religious laws, really. And there's a committee to give, that's not something that we do. But just to the way it does relate, you're going to be rather shocked, is that if the committee thinks that the child is a mamzer, she's automatically given permission for an abortion, which is really outrageous because it's not really because there's anything wrong with the child, or or she doesn't even want the child, but it's because the state has imposed this stigma and they will allow an abortion immediately. There's a committee. As far as I know, it's not, if the woman wants an abortion, she can have it, although I also know that usually they want the husband, if the husband is involved, to give permission for it. So I can't, this area is not one that we work on. And I think Israel is not so restrictive in terms of its abortion, especially if it's in the first 40 days. So that's not what we work on.
Okay, well, that's okay. Thank you for filling us in on what you do know. Do you work with Israeli Arabs as well as Israeli Jews?
Oh, I think that's a really interesting, important question. When I started the Center for Women's Justice, I went to Arab women's organizations and I asked them to join us. And they didn't, not because they don't have a similar problem. And I think this is an important thing that people understand. In Israel, Jews have to get married and divorced in a Jewish way, and Muslim women have to get married and divorced in accordance with Islamic law. And both of us have a problem of what's called a marital captivity. That's how we define now the problem of the aguna. Some people will tell you that Arab women have it a little bit easier because sometimes the court can come in and declare the marriage over. And I'm not I don't appear in the Sharia courts, so I can't tell you exactly what's happening there. But I can tell you that I was invited to Amsterdam to speak about marital captivity because in Europe they're addressing the problem of marital captivity for all types of religious women. And I gave a lecture on how to make a tort on marital captivity in Amsterdam. So the problem is one that's cross-cultural. All patriarchal religions have problems, of different types, and women pay for. So the work that we do is having an impact on cross-culturally on all sorts of, of women living under religious laws. There's a website called Women Living Under Muslim Law. And in a sense, we could have a very, very similar website called Women Living Under Jewish Laws. It's not exactly the same, but there are parallels. And in Amsterdam, there's a book that was published, about that conference that we had on marital captivity. It's called Marital Captivity. I can send you the link to that. And my article's in there, so it's nice, actually.
Oh, that'd be great. Please do share it with us. There's a question in the chat, which, if I'm interpreting it right, is very similar to one that I think I asked you when we were talking last week, in that, when these decisions happen in the courts, and let's say you win a case and it's in your favor and you're working toward the change, does that change then become the law of the land? I mean, it certainly becomes precedent, but in the way that the decisions here sort of kind of become codified as law, does that happen as well? Is it really promoting reform and change when you have those wins?
Yes, but not as clearly as I think when you have a Supreme Court precedent in the United States, that really becomes the law of the land at that point. Here, it also becomes the law of the land, but I think in the rabbinic courts, they don't think that they're subject to the Supreme Court. In other words, they answer to a higher authority. That authority is not the Supreme Court, it's God. So if they think that the Supreme Court has issued a ruling that, it violates God's laws, there will be definitely pushback. But what happens, I think, is that with time, it's accepted that, oh yes, we can't really say that women don't inherit it and get any of the marital property at the time of divorce, that we can't possibly say that all of the property is the man's, and that he, at the time of the divorce, at best she gets back what she brought into the marriage, and if he managed to squander that, it's not hers either. So that, if that's the original patriarchal biblical law, it's no longer accepted as that, and that even that that had to have a Supreme Court ruling at the time. So it's definitely evolves and things change, but it's harder. It's hard. I think it's harder, and part of I think the goal of the Center for Women's Justice is to bring these cases. In other words, I would love to win every single one of our cases, but part of it is to bring the cases and to insist that the Supreme Court deal with these issues. And it also raises the issues to the fore. And all you people who know about the work that we do can begin to understand that we have a problem of democracy and women's rights in Israel. And you mentioned before that you think there's a balance, but I don't really agree, that there's a problem balancing religious laws and civil laws. I don't want to balance that. In other words, I don't think it should be a matter of give and take. I think that there are certain basic rights and basic human rights, and I don't want to give them up. And I don't think Israel should be giving them up, and I don't think women should be paying that price. So that is a clear message that we have at the Center for Women's Justice all the time, and that they don't have to we don't have to pay that price to be a Jewish state, and so that's what.
No, I agree with you. A good point, well made. Because I want to clarify, there was a question in the chat, and I think that we talked about this too. If someone decides to have a secular wedding, right? They don't involve a rabbi, they have a secular contract, whatever, that's a possibility, right?
Well, there's a lot of, in Hebrew it's tithitha, there's a lot of foment on the ground, and a lot of people have stopped going through the rabbinate to get married. So they'll go and they'll get married in Cyprus, or they'll get married in their own ceremony that they play out in Israel, or with a reform or conservative rabbi who isn't recognized in the state of Israel as able to officiate at an official state marriage. And so people are doing that all the time. Now, if they go and get a civil marriage outside of the country, they have no choice but to get divorced in the rabbinic courts right now. That's another point that we're going to try and work.
Even if they don't have a religious wedding, the divorce still has to go through the rabbinic courts.
Right, because the law is that all Jews have to get married and divorced through the religious courts, but that the religious courts, the rabbinic courts, have sole jurisdiction on the issues of marriage and divorce. So if you said, you know what, I just don't want to do this, I don't want to go through the rabbinic courts, and you say, I'm going to go to to Sinai and get married in Sinai and have a vacation in Sinai in Egypt and get married, and I'm going to come back. And then I'll go to the family court to get divorced. And then they find out that because of a bad decision given in 2004 by the Supreme Court Justice Barak, actually, the jurisdiction remains to this day in the rabbinic courts if it involved two Jews. I think we're trying to work and to reopen that case law so that what will happen is if you do get married civilly, you will get divorced civilly in the family courts. But that's one of our goals, and we have not gotten there yet.
Right. And you said that applies between two Jews, but if it's an interfaith couple,
if it's an interfaith couple, they get that by definition. They go to the family court.
Right.
And it's a bit of an interesting and complicated process, but the family court will send will ask the courts, of the respective religions of the two couples what they think. And then after those courts usually say, we don't recognize those marriages, it'll go back to the family court. And the family court will deserve a couple divorce. The problem comes out is one of the parties doesn't agree. And that's that. I actually have never had to deal with a case like that. But Rachel, do you hear me? Because you were frozen.
I'm a sec, but you're back. No worries.
Okay.
Let me ask you another question. When you are arguing your cases, are you using secular law or halacha law?
Most of the time, secular law. Most of the time, what I will argue is that there's a violation of human rights or basic rights, that I will argue that there are problems with civil procedure, that there were violations of procedural rules. And most importantly, I will argue, that there are torts or damages. And so I use civil law, but well, especially when we go into the Supreme Court, we will always note the fact that there's a more progressive and liberal interpretation of Jewish law that can be applied. So and obviously when we go into the religious courts, which we do also, we always argue the halacha. In other words, if we have to, we sometimes, we know that a case, we go into the religious court if we think there's a case here that might set a precedent in the civil courts. So when we appear in the religious courts, we obviously have to argue religious law. So we're versed in both halacha and in civil law.
That's amazing. I have one more question about the work that you're doing within the courts, and then I want to move on to some of the other work that your organization is doing. And I don't quite understand this question, but it's probably because I'm not well versed in the issue, but hopefully it will make sense to you. It's coming from one of our listeners. About the recent decision about reform and conservative recognition.
Yes.
What does that mean exactly?
It's actually a very important case. It's a very easy case. It should have been decided like that a long time ago. What happened was the state recognizes for purposes of aliyah, in other words, if you can come on to Israel if you're Jewish, whether it's by birth or through conversion. If you converted outside of the country, there are certain rules for the different denominations. In Israel, the state wasn't recognizing conversions from the conservative and reform courts for purposes of the Chok HaShvut, of coming to Israel. They only recognized conversions done by the rabbinic courts, but they also recognized conversions of the ultra-Orthodox courts. So the reform and conservative movements appealed to the Supreme Court, saying that this is discriminatory and they should also recognize the conservative and reform conversions. And it only took the Supreme Court 15 years to make this decision. And that's the very kind of sad thing. The Supreme Court tends to drag its feet when it comes to these decisions. The women of the wall, for example, we represent the original women of the wall. It's only like 30 years. I mean, it's really an embarrassment. They started in 1989 with the first case, and the state, and this answers one of your other questions. The state has yet to articulate a clear precedent in the matter. At one point, precedent was pretty clear, I'd say. And the Attorney General's office balked, and the Prime Minister balked, and so that case is still outstanding. And we got into the case making a very interesting argument about overreaching regulations. We argued that the Commissioner of the Wall had no authority to issue regulations preventing women from access to the Torah scrolls that were being provided by the state at the wall. And it's an easy case, okay? If the state is giving you certain religious services, which in this case are the Torah scrolls, how can they say that women can't get the Torah scrolls? It's such an easy case, and I've been making it for like, I don't know, I think this case I have been making for like the past 5 years or something ridiculous like that. So that's one of the problems, that because of politics, and every time the Supreme Court tries, to articulate something in a way that I think reflects democracy, they're always worried about the pushback from the religious community and the religious political parties, and I'm a little worried about this decision, because although I love it, I'm worried, that if the right wing gets into power, they're going to try and pass a law to bypass it. So that's what that we're up. We have a good fight here.
Yeah, yeah. And you're doing a lot of work beyond what you're doing in terms of your casework. You're doing a lot of proactive work. I think you said to me in terms of critical thinking and prevention on the ground. I think we're sort of tell us a little bit more about what those activities are.
Well, one of the very exciting thing that we have is a podcast, and it's being done by Rivka Lubitch and Nitzan Kaspi Shiloni, both of whom work for the Center for Women's Justice. It's in Hebrew. So if you understand Hebrew, you're certainly welcome to listen to it. And I think you'll find that it's really quite illuminating. But we're going to hopefully we'll do it in Hebrew also. In English also. And we have a very active Twitter and Facebook page. But one of the things, one of our goals in all of this is to challenge the status quo and the common sense. In other words, we want people to stop thinking in a certain way. We want them to think differently. So that's our critical thinking. And the other stuff that we do on the ground, for example, is that we've written very progressive prenuptial agreements to try and help people avoid the problem of marital captivity. And we also set up a private rabbinic court to free some of our clients who were just not, nothing was going on for them in the rabbinic courts. So for example, we represent a woman whose husband was put in jail for 30 years, but he was still refusing to give our client a divorce. And she just said, we went to court and asked him to be released from prison. And which we think is because we thought it's a violation. It's not a solution to violate someone's human rights, when, as an answer to a severe violation of your own client's human rights. So we actually, with the permission of the client, obviously, who said, he's not going to give me a get. My kids haven't seen their father. Just get him out. Okay. The rabbinic, he was the poster boy child for the rabbinic courts, and they went crazy. And there was once the client said she wanted her husband out, they had to release him. And we set up a private rabbinic court, which gave her this private get, okay? Or actually it was an annulment of her marriage. And although it hasn't been recognized by the state, it gave her a lot of solace that she was able to get this annulment. And what this case shows is also the bankruptcy of the patriarchal system of marriage and divorce. I mean, it's absurd that this woman had to sit in jail, hasn't had to get till this very day, really, that one recognized by the state. And that the only way the state can deal with a recalcitrant husband is to deny his most basic freedom of, so that's what we did in that case.
Yeah. There's so many questions being that in, and I'm going to try and cover ground. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but in it, obviously this refusal, this marriage captivity, and the refusal to give a get is a form of abuse, right? And there can be financial abuse with it as well. Is your organization doing a lot of work with, physical domestic violence as well?
We don't, we're not, that's not an issue of church and state. Okay, of course we have a lot of clients who are subjected to domestic violence and who are abused in very, whether greatly or less greatly,
Right.
Physically. But we're not a a home for what's it called, a miklat, for women. We don't, we don't deal only with fixing problems of domestic violence. What we deal with is we represent women who are subjected to domestic violence and want to get out of their abusive relationships.
Right, right. Looking ahead, what are some of your goals for your organization?
We want to close our organization. In other words, what I mean by that is we're hoping to achieve a situation where you will no longer need the Center for Women's Justice, and where it's very, very clear that women are entitled to their full human rights and and their full liberty and their full dignity. But of course, that's in the long-term goal. But in the short-term goal, we would like to civil marriage and divorce. We would like to see all women, women get married without necessary prenuptial agreement. We also have prenuptial agreements for people who want to get married civilly and don't want to be, and want to avoid as much as they can the rabbinic establishment. And we also hope that people will begin to understand that the issue here is one of democracy and one of liberty, and one that should be important, I think, to Jewish men and women all over the world. And they should all be joining us in our demand that the state of Israel not compromise on any democratic right or any freedom, in the name of religion. And that's just not acceptable. So that's what we're hoping for. And
well, we appreciate you
and
doing
it's
the work
going
to make it so.
I think it's gonna, and I believe, I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but I believe that it has to happen, because I don't believe that Israel can sustain this. We are not Iran in every other way. We are very open and very progressive and very creative, and we have to figure a way to fix this one.
Right. And do you have a lot of men working with you in the work that you do, or is it only women?
Right now, the staff is only women, but I can tell you that I once said someone someone in the office, I said, we're going to really make it when we have a non-Jewish male, and gay person. And we've had, in other words, we had this wonderful young man, anthropologist, who volunteered for us a few years ago, and he was working for the Center for Women's Justice. We've had male students who are great, who've worked for us. On our board, we have male board members, and I think and we have a male. One of our board members is on the Hartman Institute. He's a rabbi and a professor, and an academic, and we do have a lot of male supporters, but our staff is all women.
Right. Well, no, that's I didn't only mean your staff, so it's good to know that it's a co-ed approach, right? It takes a whole community to make this change, because it's for all of us. It's not just for women.
I don't want I only have grandsons. I don't have any granddaughters yet. And I don't want my grandsons, not only my granddaughters, to live in a country that doesn't, fully respect human rights and the rights of women. I don't want that.
Jamie's already coming on. I still have 2 questions left, so I guess we're not going to get to them. I'm gonna leave you with one last question. How has being part of JWFNY's collective impacted your leadership?
It has actually impacted it in a lot of specific ways and a lot of broad ways. In other words, specifically, it's helped me think about moral courage. It's helped me think about board, how I'm managed, who are my board members and what my board should be look like, about succession. It has helped me in very, very, very specific and real ways. And I think it's also opened my eyes to tikkun olam as it in the Jewish sense, and how it's being given expression abroad, because I'm so used to dealing with my parochial issues, my issues here in Israel, that to see what's happening abroad has also enabled me to think differently, to relate to what I'm doing differently, and to understand also how important the diaspora, or the Jewish women in outside of Israel are for me. So it's been really a wonderful experience, and again, I want to thank you for it.
Thank you for
Thank you so much, Susan, for taking the time to share your wisdom and your story with us. It's extraordinary. And thank you, Rachel, of course, for leading us through this conversation. Susan, something you said really spoke to me about how these issues relate directly to a democratic society, and that it's not a woman's issue, but a human rights issue, and that no right should be trampled, that's my word, not yours, based on perceived, again, my word, religious law. I'm so inspired by your leadership, and everyone here I know is blown away by the depth and breadth of your work at the Center for Women's Justice. Before we go, we always like to leave our audience with a few actions they can take. So we'll share the links in the chat, and then everybody will email these to you tomorrow. But here we go. By directly supporting the Center for Women's Justice, you ensure that Israeli women have a right to equality, dignity, and justice under Jewish law. And you can join the Center for Women's Justice family by signing up for their newsletter and connecting to them on social media. Read and share Susan's most recent amazing op-ed for International Agunah Day to raise awareness of the impact of get refusal. This was the 10th event in our ongoing series of Crown Jewel Conversations. We've now featured all 10 leaders in our first cohort of the collective. If you missed any of these extraordinary conversations, or you just want to see them again, all the recordings are on our website. And although we won't have a Crown Jewel conversation next month, we do have some exciting events coming up. Many of you were at our convening in last October, and because there was so much interest in this topic, we're launching a Convening Revisited panel series. And the first panel will take place on Tuesday, March 23rd at noon, where Paula Pretlow, Sally Gottesman, and Alyssa Doctoroff will expand on our earlier conversation about Jewish women and philanthropy. We hope you'll also join us on Thursday, April 29th from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. for our annual Bejeweled Gala celebration, where we'll celebrate visionary women leaders and their extraordinary social impact. We're delighted to welcome Rebecca Traister, the author of Good and Mad, and Yolanda Savage Narva, the Director of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Union for Reform Judaism, as our special guest speakers. We'll also announce the new members of the third cohort of the collective, and it's going to be a packed and exciting 60 minutes. We'll send you the links to register for both events tomorrow. Thank you again to Susan for the work that you're doing and for being here, and Rachel, and thank you all for being with us today. We'll see you soon. Have a good afternoon, and please wear your masks. Thanks.